Hello and welcome to Crucible of Words for a little bit of bonus legacy content for you today. With Phyrexia All Will Be One coming out soon, I thought I'd do a little set review, but because I only do legacy content and not that many cards from a new set make their way to legacy, I'm instead doing my top 10 cards that I think can see play in legacy from the new set. So let's get into it. First up, we got a Planeswalker. Now Planeswalkers with static abilities have notably been pretty good in legacy, things like Narset and Karn for example. And even the Ashiok, the one hybrid one, has seen some play as well. Now this one is also a 3-mana Planeswalker, which is the sweet spot for good Planeswalkers, and it's 4 loyalty the turn you play it if you plus it, so that's relatively durable. Let's see what his abilities are. Being able to activate the abilities of creatures you control as though they had haste is pretty powerful, I think. It makes all your mana dorks tap immediately so they can kind of fuel more stuff and you can really go wide quickly. But things like Fiend Artisan exist in the meta and Oswald Fiddlebender, so being able to use those straight up is quite good, or being able to use them twice in one turn with the untap ability, that seems quite potent too. And maybe this will let some slightly more expensive creatures be worthwhile. So normally if you've got a slightly more expensive creature with a tap ability, they're just not good enough for Legacy because they have to survive a whole turn cycle before they do anything. Whereas with this, they don't have to do that, so you might be able to get a bit of value and maybe even get 2 bits of value the turn you play it, which is quite a big game and changes the evaluation of certain cards when this is in play. The minus ability is pretty good. So you can mill yourself and get something back. So you can power up your Fiend Artisan and then put a Fiend Artisan into put another one into play from your graveyard, for example. This is a powerful Planeswalker, in my opinion, and I think it was going to see a little bit of legacy play here and there. Nick Fitt's always looking for weird sort of stuff. And the fact is, you play a Mana Dork on turn 1, play this on turn 2, and then you can untap your Mana Dork and play another spell, and you're really sort of ramping out there. And Mana Dork's in Legacy pretty good, like Ignoble Hierarch is in the colours for this quite nicely, so I'm expecting to see some sort of maybe like Jundi or Junk type decks with it. So yeah, I think this card is going to see a little bit of Legacy play. Next up is Venerated Rot Priest. So this is a 1-mana 1/2 Phyrexian Druid with Toxic 1, but the important part is whenever a creature you control becomes a target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter. So this is sort of like a pseudo protection spell for your infect creatures in the infect deck, where if you get one of your creatures lightning bolted or something, you at least get a little bit of value out of it and hit them. And this can deal some poison damage on itself. Like, it doesn't get the effect of Pump very nicely in terms of, oh, okay, I can give it +4/+4 and just smash you for 5 poison. We don't have that on it, but Toxic 1 can build up the poison counters. Now, the fact that it triggers off of spells your opponents cast as well as the ones you cast means that if you play a creature and play a couple of pump spells on it, each of them just gets +1, and that goes straight to your opponent's dome. So I think this is going to see a little bit of play and worth testing. I know people who play Infect who are much better at the deck than I am. I've barely played the deck. I know some people have got some buzz about this one and what they can do with it, as well as some people who are going to try and do some weird and wonderful combos with it, which is a whole different thing. But I think this is going to find a slot in Legacy. Whether or not it will end up being good enough, I don't know, but it's going to see some Legacy play at some point in the next couple of months, I suspect. Next up, we have Skrelv, Defectomite. This is kind of Mother of Runes. It can't protect itself, but it can give something toxic, which might be useful, it might not be. And it's hexproof from the colour, so it's not quite the same as protection. So it's a little bit weaker, but the fact that it can't be blocked is kind of similar as well. It means it's much better on offense than it is on defense. But it's an artifact, Mother of Runes, and artifacts are notoriously quite useful because you can pull them out with various things and there's lots of synergies. Notably, Oswald Fiddlebender is one of the cards I would like for this. So Oswald Fiddlebender is a card that you know I love. I play it in Mono White Painter. You can use that to fish out a Mother of Runes if you need one. So this is kind of just like a sort of bonus Mother of Runes that's easier to find. So I think it's probably going to see a little bit of play. I don't think it's going to be better than Mother of Runes, but I think some decks will want it as an option. Next up we have Planar Disruption. Now this is a pretty boring common card. It's 1 and a white enchantment. You enchant an artifact, creature or planeswalker. It can't attack, block, or have its activated abilities activated. So this is kind of like an upgrade from things like, I think it was a Rest maybe. I think there's a 3-mana version of this which isn't good enough, but I think an Enchantress deck is probably going to want to play this. Enchantments are harder to remove now than they were, and the flexibility that it's artifact, creature, or planeswalker means it's going to have game in pretty much all matchups somewhere along the line. So I think you might be able to have these main deck, or at least have them as a useful sideboard card. Whether if your opponent plays out some like LEDs and passes, you can hit them with that. If they've got a scary creature, you can nullify it. If it's a planeswalker, I think this card is boring, not very exciting, but crosses the threshold of things that people might play, especially in a deck that cares about enchantments. Next up, we have Conduit of Worlds. Now, my favourite Magic the Gathering card is Crucible of Worlds. Sorry, Crucible of Worlds is my channel name. So yeah, so Crucible of Worlds is my favourite Magic card. This is kind of like that. So you can play land cards from your graveyard. So that's the Crucible text, but it costs 1 more mana. But for that extra mana, you're getting a hell of a lot of value here. So this lets you play cards from your graveyard. So they have to be permanent cards, but that's pretty impressive. It's only as a sorcery, but most permanent cards aren't going to have flash anyway. Like, I guess Endurance is the main one that does have flash that sees a lot of play at the moment. But that's fine. If you're getting a free Endurance from your graveyard, that's still fine. And this extra value is a lot. Now, currently the format is very aggressive. So being able to have the turn to leverage something like this, not necessarily a thing that we can do too easily. But I feel the format's going to slow down a little bit, because I think it's very likely we get bans in the near future, which means that maybe having some slightly more mid-rangey or longer-term game prospects is the thing we want. And this card is inherently powerful. Crucible does see some play. This is just Crucible, but better if you're in green. So I'd be very surprised if this didn't find a place somewhere. Now, quite how many copies you're going to run, etc., I don't know. But I think this is worth... The sheer value of it is just great, right? I'm probably going to build some sort of deck that Oswald Fiddlebenders into it, no doubt. Alright, let's go on to the next one. Mercurial Spelldancer. People have been comparing this to Dreadhorde Arcanist, and I think that comparison is not that accurate, but also not unfair either. So this is a 2-mana 2/1 that can't be blocked, which is quite important. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put a counter on it. Whenever it deals combat damage, you may remove 2 counters from it. If you do, the next instant or sorcery spell you cast this turn, you get a copy of it. So this is going to be relatively easy to power up with counters. As we've seen with Dragon's Rage Channeler, reeling off a load of spells in 1 or 2 turns is quite easy. And the fact that it's unblockable means that you're not really going to have any trouble getting the counters. If it remains alive, you're going to be able to get your double spells. Now, being able to weave those nicely together is going to be a little bit difficult sometimes. But the fact is, you don't remove all the oil counters from it. So you can stack up oil counters on it as much as you want for when you're ready to use it, which is nice. So you can sort of have 3 or 4 counters on it and then only start peeling them off when you need it. It's not like it toggles on and off type thing where we've seen some cards a little bit like that. This kind of fits in a similar spot to Ledger Shredder, where it provides you value, except instead of providing you graveyard value and growing that way, it provides you more spells. Whereas Dreadhorde Arcanist was graveyard based, this isn't graveyard based. That's quite nice to have a card that doesn't rely on the graveyard, that can do some pretty powerful things. And the fact is, it's any instant or sorcery spell. So you can cast a few cheap cantrips, and then cast something bigger and more exciting for your bigger spell, and then get copies of that. So I think this will find a place somewhere. Not quite sure where that's going to be, especially since we're expecting bans. So the tempo decks in the format are going to get a bit of a tweak at the moment. But I think this is one to keep an eye on for sure. Next we have Atraxa, Grand Unifier. So this is a 7-mana card with a whole bunch of keywords on it. They're pretty good keywords: Death Touch, Lifelink, Vigilance, Flying. Not really sure Death Touch matters too much on a 7/7, but it's there anyway. So this is just going to beat most things in combat. It's going to keep your life total healthy. Fair enough. Its current to play ability is pretty strong. You reveal the top 10 cards of your library, and for each card type, you can put one of the revealed cards into your hand of that type. So it does mention the new card type battle that we know nothing about, which could make this card much better or worse. We don't really know, really. But just being able to like put in an artifact, or let's say you've got an enchantment like Sneak Attack, for example, you can go and find that. Or you've got a sorcery like Show and Tell, so you can reload. Or just some more creatures. So basically you cast this, or get this into play, and then you immediately get to find your next threat and maybe an answer and stuff like that. So you basically just reload with it. It's kind of similar to Griselbrand in that respect, which is interesting. Is this better than Griselbrand? I don't think so, but it is there is one significant part of this card that is better than Griselbrand, and that is the fact that it's green. Because it's green, it means you can natural order this into play as well. So because this has more flexibility in terms of the decks that can play it, I'd be very surprised if this didn't see some play somewhere. It's, you know, it's the powerful enough level of massive creature, and the text on it is pretty sweet, as well as being green. All right. Oh, it also pitches to Force of Will as well, which is not nothing either. So it kind of does quite a lot here. All right, let's go on to the next card. Sheoldred's Edict. Now, this, again, is a boring card. It is just another Edict effect. We've seen Edict effects loads of times. Diabolic Edict used to see a little bit of play a while ago. Sudden Edict sees a decent amount of play in the mono black decks now, because the split second on it is very powerful. This is not as powerful as that, because split second is really, really good, especially when you've got these tempo decks running around. However, the flexibility of this is very strong. That makes it a much better main deck inclusion for a lot of lists, because non-token creature, or a creature token, or a planeswalker. That's quite a lot of options, especially the non-token and token creature distinction. It means if somebody's got a Monastery Mentor, you've actually got a pretty clean answer to it here, things like that. And I think this is just going to be one of those cards that just slots in nicely. I was playing a league the other day with a black-white deck, and I had 2 removal spells in my sideboard that I think were cast down, and I just would rather have had this. So I'm probably going to be playing a couple of copies of this here and there. I think it's a good card. It's rarely going to be dead in matchups because people are going to be having these. Even some of the Storm decks now, like the mono black Storm deck, runs the as a Saga as a backup plan. Now, you're probably not going to want that in this matchup necessarily, but again, it's just a useful thing that's relatively surgical in how you can apply it. So I think this is going to see a little bit of play, but not be anything anyone is excited about. Next up, we have another boring card, the Filigree Silex. This is a 2-mana artifact where you can tap to put a counter on it, and then you can tap and sack to destroy each non-land permanent with a mana value equal to the number of counters that it had on it. Or you can tap it and remove 10 oil counters from among permanents you control, which will include other things as well as Filigree Silex. Not sure how many oil counter things are going to see play in Legacy, to be honest. But then you can dome something for 10. Now, that last bit of text, probably not relevant, but it might come up. The fact that it might come up in like a 0.7% of things is probably why this sees play, because this is just Ratchet Bomb. Ratchet Bomb is a sideboard card that you sometimes see in colorless decks and decks that maybe need to destroy certain permanents that don't have cleaner ways of doing it in the colors they're in. So it's a card that already sees play. This is the exact same card with slightly more text on it. So it's going to see play, but it's not going to be exciting. It's going to be pretty dull, and most of the time you can just play a Ratchet Bomb instead. Like, you might end up in a situation where you get to remove 10 oil counts from it. It's nice to have as a potential, and it's pretty much free to have it because legendary artifacts doesn't really matter. It's legendary creatures that matter in Legacy because of Karakas. Alright, and let's see the final card. Mycosynth Gardens. This card is bananas in my opinion. So, it taps for colorless mana, comes in untapped. That's a reasonable start. You can filter mana of colors you want from it. That's fine. And it might come up useful. It means that you're not necessarily restricting yourself color-wise. Like if you've got loads of soul lands and something in a deck like this, then you might have some spare mana that you can use to get color. So that actually might be a useful line of the card. The real reason you're playing this card, though, is the final bit. Pay X and tap. This card becomes a copy of target non-token artifact you control with mana value X. So you can't copy as a Saga tokens, but what you can copy is things like Lion's Eye Diamond. If you've got a Lion's Eye Diamond in play, you play this, you can immediately tap it to copy the Lion's Eye Diamond. And Lion's Eye Diamond's ability is not a tap ability, it's just sacrifice. So you can immediately turn this into a Lion's Eye Diamond and sacrifice it. Another use is to play Phyrexian Dreadnought. With a trigger on the stack of the Phyrexian Dreadnought, you can make a copy of it. This won't get the trigger because, you know, there's no come into play on it. It's already in play. So you just pay 1 and tap this, and it becomes a 12/12 Trampler, which is pretty good. And I think there's been an uptick in Dreadnought decks lately. So I imagine this will slot very nicely into them. Maybe you can even reduce the amount of colours those decks play, because sometimes they're 3-colour decks. Maybe you can just shift it down to a 2-colour deck and add in these Mycosynth Gardens. Maybe have another little bit of stuff going on with it. And the other thing that I thought would be quite... Well, I'm going to do it at some point, because if you watch my channel, you know I love to make Marit Lage any way I can make Marit Lage. So what this can do is if you've got a liquid metal coating and a Dark Depths, you can turn your Dark Depths into an artifact. Then you can tap your Mycosynth Gardens and it becomes a Dark Depths with no counters on it. Then you can sacrifice and make a 20/20. Now, is that the best use of this card? Probably not. Is it something I'm going to do with this on my channel? Oh, definitely. I'm definitely going to do that at some point. You can probably just throw in Dark Depths into like a Karn deck as an option to have in your deck, because quite often the Karn decks you're fetching liquid metal coating early on anyway. That's quite often the first thing you fetch, so you may as well just have the free ability to make a 20/20 in your deck anyway. But some people like me might just try and go a bit harder on that. But the main thing this is going to be doing is getting some like broken artifacts like Lion's Eye Diamond or Phyrexian Dreadnought, which is pretty good if you're just paying the normal rate for it of 1 mana. So I think there's probably a whole bunch of other things this can do, whether it's copying stuff you're getting off Emery, so it can be a Bauble in an emergency, it can be Lotus Petals or whatever, or you can get another Spell Bomb. So this is probably going to slot into a lot of the artifacty decks. It can be another Grindstone, it can be another Painter's Servant if you need it. Feels like this has got some... The sky's the limit on this one, really, and I definitely think this is going to be seeing play in a lot of decks. Whether or not it makes entirely new decks or just improves old decks, I don't know. There's probably going to be some sort of newer builds that rise with this, but I suspect mostly it's going to be improving some other decks or tweaking other decks slightly to incorporate it. Like you can copy a Wishclaw Talisman as well, which is pretty nice. All right, those are the cards that I think will see play. There's some other cards I think have potential as well. For example, there's a land that's like reverse Pendelhaven, so it gives +2/+1 to a 1/1 as long as your opponent's got 3 poison counters, and it's also color fixing for Phyrexian spells, which every infect and toxic creature now has, because they did an errata a while back. So all the old like Glistener Elf and Blighted Agent, they all have the Phyrexian creature type. So I think that might be one that sees play, and there's a few other little bits that could see play, and some wild stuff that maybe someone can find a way to use with some relatively interesting effects on. But these are the 10 cards I think are most likely to see play in the next few months in Legacy. So I hope you enjoyed this bonus content for you on a Saturday, and thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Please do these things, it helps me. All right, goodbye.